I'm here to talk to you about two things: the future of urban air mobility, or rather the present of urban air mobility, because that is what Voom is offering today, as well as corporate innovation. And just for a bit of background, before I explain how Airbus, which is the owner of Voom today, does it right, I am not a lifelong Airbus employee. Before joining Voom in 2016, I was a banker and a helicopter pilot for pleasure, which is why they reached out to me and asked me to join the team as they founded the company. Now, as I said, two things: the future of air mobility today and corporate innovation just before lunch. So, how do I go here? There we go. What was the genesis of Voom? Well, this is a picture that everyone in the room is likely familiar with: congestion, right? Fact of the matter is, by 2030, more than 50% of the population, the world's population, is going to be living in cities, which means that our ground infrastructure are saturated. If any of you lives or goes frequently to Sao Paulo or Mexico City, those are two perfect examples of the kind of problems that we're illustrating here. Sao Paulo has the infamous reputation for fascinating traffic jams. I think over the past 4 years, there were 5 traffic jams longer than 200 kilometers, of which one of them was more than 340 kilometers long. It is estimated that the yearly impact of traffic jams onto the Brazilian economy is north of $30 billion a year. And as the world urbanizes, this problem is only going to get worse. We estimate that by 2030, that cost is going to rise by 46%. Now, obviously, we need to do something about it, and Airbus thinks this is the solution, or at least part of the solution. So we believe in a world where you would be able, at your fingertips, by pressing a touchscreen on your phone, you will be able to not only get your parcels delivered, but also travel intra-city to the airport within a few minutes of booking your ride. And on that vision of the future, there is 3 of the very prominent innovations that Airbus is currently pushing forward. Obviously, you already have the parcel delivery. So this is a picture of Skyways, the drone delivery service that is currently operational in Singapore. But you also have 2 of the vehicles that are currently being developed within the Airbus group. The 4 big rotor one is the City Airbus. It's a project that was launched 2 years ago, carries 4 people, first flight, scheduled for early next year. The second one in the back, this one, is actually already flying. So this is a Vahana. And the Vahana was a project that was launched at the same time as Voom. Voom was focusing on the customer side of the problem, like bringing urban air mobility to the world today. And Vahana was preparing the next generation of vehicles. So Vahana is a distributed, fully autonomous electrical vehicle. It's 8 engines. It has tilt rotors, so it takes off vertically with the engines facing upwards. The wing tilt, it flies like a plane, and when it reaches its destination, the wings tilt back and it lands vertically. Fully electric, fully autonomous. We believe that this should be the reality of the world in the next 5 to 10 years. Now, obviously, quite a few things need to happen. Today, urban air mobility is limited by the current technology, helicopters, and by the current business models. However, a revolution is coming. Revolution on the side of the business models, right? The same way the taxi industry was revolutionized 6 or 7 years ago with the likes of Lyft, Uber, Didi. We believe that kind of revolution is coming to the urban air mobility industry. And Voom is part of that transformation. Before us, no one dared offering helicopter rides on demand. But today, if you are in Sao Paulo, if you're in Mexico City and you have an iPhone, I urge you, download the app and try the app for yourself. you can get your helicopter ride within 60 minutes of booking it. Not entirely on demand, but bear with us, this is coming. And this is the first time this has been tried. This is the first time as well that we're experimenting in terms of how many people travel at the same time. Traditionally, helicopter operators would charge you for the whole cabin for a whole hour. We charge you for the seat, for the minute of flights. So we are innovating, we're experimenting in that respect. And then of course, as volumes grow, helicopters are expensive. It's a matter of fact. They're expensive to develop, they're expensive to manufacture, and in the world today, there is 25,000 civilian helicopters, 25,000. That number is ridiculously small. But if you envision a world where everyday commuters can take the helicopter, or rather the next generation vehicle, that number is going to grow in the hundreds of thousands. And then that development cost that you have to now pour into a series of a few hundred helicopters is going to be spread over thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. And that's going to drive the cost down. And that's already what we're trying to do with Voom, where we try to democratize helicopter travel. As a quick indication, 50% of our customers today, when they do their first flight with us, had never flown into a helicopter. And that makes sense, right? Who would think that a helicopter ride could be at the tip of your fingers and affordable? And I'll get back into our pricing a little bit later. So that's on the business model side. Of course, on the technological side, we already see a revolution happening. So we heard about robo-race a little bit earlier, electrification, distributed propulsion, new batteries. These evolutions are going to come to the airspace industry as well, and it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And we're looking forward to getting these a reality. So of course, it's going to take time, right? Today we are innovating in terms of business models, but again, in 5 to 10 years' time, that technology is going to come to us. Other things that are coming, so we heard about robo-race and the autonomous driving. Autonomous flying is also going to be a reality. Intermediary step, augmented flight management systems, making sure that the pilot has all the information, communicates with air traffic management on a seamless, in a seamless way, gets all the information on time and can act on it fast and in a safe way. Now, Airbus looks at the whole value chain of urban air mobility and builds not only on its strengths, so obviously everything related to the vehicle. So of course, for those of you who don't know what Airbus does, we mostly do large aircrafts. So you probably all flew from around the world. You probably flew, or 50% chance actually that you flew on an Airbus aircraft. But we also provide everything that's related to servicing and maintaining those aircraft. So for the next generation of vehicle, Airbus is also looking into providing this. But we're not the only ones. Today, there is 70 startups or established companies that are looking into the next generation of vehicle. 70 companies, right? And Airbus has 2 of those prototypes. That means that 68 others are looking into the next generation of vehicle. This is a fantastic opportunity, and that's why we think the future of urban mobility is bright. And on the other side of the spectrum, and this goes into what I want to talk to you about a little bit later, is corporate innovation. Airbus is a B2B brand. They sell aircraft to airlines. And the reason why I was doubtful that more than half of you knew about Airbus is because the fact of the matter is when people say, oh, I fly in an airplane, usually people think Boeing, right? We heard about the number of crashes that happen equivalent to a 747. 747 is a Boeing aircraft. But Airbus has 50% of the market, and they're a B2B brand. Now, Voom, which is a company that I work for now, was the first foray of Airbus into the business-to-consumer market. And I'll get into more details on that. And of course, in the middle, Airbus, based partly on the experiment that they did with Voom, is also looking at everything in the middle of the value chain as well, which means everything related to flight operations. Today, aircraft manufacturers sell their aircraft to airlines. the same way an automobile manufacturer is going to sell you the car. But tomorrow, when you have automation and you can call your car or your helicopter on your iPhone, why would you own the car? So there is a lot of reflection going around the evolution of business models, and not only in airspace, right? In automobile, it's the same question. There is talks about GM, to give an example, or Ford, actually rethinking the way they sell cars or lease cars or manage cars. So there is the same kind of reflection for the aerospace industry. Air traffic management, big industry. Depending on the regulatory environment, sometimes privatized, sometimes nationalized, but in any case, still very manual. And of course, when you envision hundreds of thousands of those urban air mobility vehicles flying around, you need to make them that seamless and automated. And the final point is a ground infrastructure, right? If you really want to make urban air mobility a reality, you need to be able to land at convenient locations, probably not in the street, but on top of buildings. And Airbus is also looking into that kind of thing. So from an experiment that started 3 years ago in 2015, a whole new division has sprung from the experiment and is now becoming the reality of is now trying to make urban air mobility a reality of today with Voom, but mostly for tomorrow. Now, Voom, as I was saying, is the reality of urban air mobility today. Right? We operate currently, as I said, in Sao Paulo, in Brazil, and in Mexico City for obvious congestion reasons. And so what we did is we looked at the traditional helicopter charter business and tried to figure out, can we make it better? And the fact of the matter is those charter operators fly very little. Why? Because if you're the CEO of a company and you need to go to the airport and you call them and you're like, I need to go to the airport in 15 minutes, can you send a helicopter? How much is it going to cost? And you're in the center of Sao Paulo, they're going to tell you, yes, it's not a problem. I can send you a helicopter now. It's going to cost you $1,500 to $2,000. Why? Because they consider that you're going to immobilize a helicopter for an hour and you're going to take up all the seats. Now, the problem with this is, of course, not everyone can afford such an entry ticket. So they fly little, and then they have a lot of fixed costs between purchasing, insurance, maintenance, and so they have to rebalance those costs onto few flying hours. Now, Voom came along, did a test, and figured out, actually, we believe there is a market there, but obviously not at $1,000 to $2,000 per trip, but rather at 10 to 20% of this. So what we do now is we offer helicopter flights by the seat, by the time that you actually fly, and it will cost you in Sao Paulo to go from the city center to the airport. So it's about a 15-minute flight, $150 to $250. And let me tell you, the market is much larger than it used to be. And this creates a virtuous cycle, right? We have a relatively low price, which means there is more people, which means the helicopter operator fly more, which means they spread their fixed costs onto a wider base, and they can charge us less, which makes the whole business model kind of work. And then the next question is, well, traditionally, they were charging for the whole cabin. How does Voom do it? Well, we have developed a proprietary technology that pools passengers, right? Because obviously, we only have a limited number of helicopters to fly with. We have to reposition those helicopters depending on where passengers want them, which always gives us a bit of a window to pool passengers. So the idea behind the technology is, because we have that window, we're able to make sure that our helicopters always fly at maximum available capacity. Now, let me show you what this looks like. You're having your coffee, and you want to go to the office in Sao Paulo. You go onto the app, you book it. 60 minutes later, you go to the helipad, your helicopter's waiting for you. So not only is it a convenient way to go to the office, it's also an exceptional experience. And if you do go to those two cities that I mentioned earlier, I urge you to try it out. And there you go. Our flights in Sao Paulo and Mexico are all between 10 and 15 minutes long, and the pricing that I mentioned earlier, if you've never flown into a helicopter, I really recommend you give it a go. I'm not going to go through the details of the app, but basically we have created the whole back office of the flight management as well, where the rider, as we call them, goes on the app, selects its address, figures out where is the closest helipads that we fly from, and then books on the click of a button. And on the back end, we are only a booking platform. We work with commercially certified helicopter operators. Those helicopter operators get the information directly from our platform and organize a flight on our behalf. Now, a bit of history, and this goes back into the second point that I wanted to talk to you about corporate innovation. Airbus, by any means, is an innovative company and has historically been since the 1970s, right? In the 1970s, the main player was Boeing and the other Americans, and the Europeans were kind of left behind, and the Europeans decided that they wanted to play in the same game, so they came up with a new aircraft, the A300 at the time, was very innovative, had fly-by-wire, a lot of things that Boeing didn't have. And ever since, Airbus has tried to innovate. But they've tried to innovate in their three traditional business lines, right? Aircraft, helicopters, and defense and space, so satellite imagery, basically. Now, in 2015, there was a reflection, that's before my time, right? But there was a reflection around there is a lot of innovation that comes, especially regarding business models, from Silicon Valley. And Airbus is mostly based, at least on research and development in Europe, Germany, France. And they were worried that at some point, one of those business models would come and disrupt the traditional businesses of Airbus without them being able to react. So in 2015, they created A-Cube, the incubator of Airbus in the Silicon Valley. And A-Cube's mission statement was find and foster business models that could be disruptive to the Airbus traditional businesses. And this is what it set out to do. And the first two projects that came out of A-Cube at the time were Voom, disruptive business model, not competing with the existing business lines, right? We are not buying helicopters, we're not competing with operators, we're giving business to the clients of Airbus, and the Vahana, which is a vehicle that I showed earlier, right? So two complementary business projects with the same goal of making urban air mobility a reality. And I'll come back to the interaction between those two in a little bit when I go into the learnings of that corporate innovation. So 2015, A-Cube gets created. We submitted a business plan memo, and in January 2016, we did our first test at Sundance, the Sundance Festival, in partnership with Uber. We flew people to and from the festival. Massive success, few setbacks. We did end up in court. Apparently, it's not that easy to land in a field in a helicopter without asking authorization anyways. You know, technical details. But it was a success nonetheless. So we figured out, okay, Sundance was probably not, or rather the US was probably a little bit of a difficult environment from a legal and regulatory perspective. What is the most helicopter-friendly city in the world with the most congestion issues? Sao Paulo was selected. And in July 2016, we did our second test in Sao Paulo. It was a month-long test, so a much longer trial, right? Not just a weekend, but a month-long in partnership with Uber, so under the brand name Ubercopter. And over 1 month, we flew 1,100 passengers. So I think there was a mention earlier today about MVPs. This was our MVP, minimal viable product. Fact of the matter is, we I have 5 minutes, I'll hurry up. We had massive technological breakdowns, but we still managed to fly 1,100 passengers. And from there, we figured out, actually, there is interest, and people are willing to pay for that service. So fast forward to February 2018, we had overhauled the product and we launched our Evergreen service, which is still now ongoing in Brazil. Fast forward to March 2018, we're now up and running in Mexico City, and we now consistently, in our operating cities, fly more than 1,000 passengers every month. And in doing so, we have answered a lot of questions that Airbus was asking themselves, right? As I mentioned, Vahana, so the next generation vehicle, came to life roughly at the same time as Voom, but it was based on vastly speculative assumptions. It's a one-seater, it's fully autonomous, it's relatively fast, but as a result has a limited autonomy. And there were a lot of questions that we had no idea about, which is why, is the market ready for an air service? What is the passenger behavior? When do they fly? What time do they fly? Why do they fly? Who flies? How many people fly at the same time? Do they have luggages? Do they have kids? And how much are they actually willing to pay? So price elasticity demand curve was a complete unknown, right? Because it's so far out from the traditional operational system. So I'll move quickly on this. Just one comment on this. We've also learned that weather was a big issue, and it still is a big issue. As I mentioned, 50% of our passengers are flying helicopter for the first time. So we're introducing passengers to a new mode of transportation, and we know that they love it. We know that they love it because it's an experience. So about 50% of our passengers are there for the experience. 50% of our passengers are business travelers. And this shows into the numbers, right? The most popular times to fly are 6 to 7 p.m. on Thursdays and Fridays, when Sao Paulo and Mexico City experience the most traffic jams. And of course, the downtown to the airport is the most popular route, because if you're familiar with Sao Paulo, if you're out of luck, you can take up to 4 hours to go to the airport. So if you have a plane to catch, I suggest you jump onto the Voom app and you do it in 15 minutes. Now, my last slide is all about corporate innovation. So I talked about how Voom and Airbus are innovating in the urban air mobility space. Airbus is also innovating more broadly through the A-Cube incubator. And what we've learned is that it's not necessarily easy to innovate when you're a large corporation. Because you always have the tension between the innovators and the traditional businesses. So there is 4 takeaways from this. Experimentation, we believe, is critical. If you don't innovate, eventually your business is going to be overtaken. And we've seen this happen in history time and time again. The second thing is autonomy is a prerequisite, meaning if you put too much boundaries onto your experimenting team, they're not going to experiment. They're just going to replicate what's happening in the main business. So they need autonomy. But they also need to be able to rely on the main business. And the way to do this is communication. And we've seen this happen several times with projects that came out of A-Cube. There is no such thing as excess communication. I'll leave you on that note. Any questions?